Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our 21st Tembusu Forum on the topic, The Rise of Populism. I am Dr. Margaret Tan, Fellow and Director of Programs at Tembusu College. For the benefit of guests who are joining us for the first time, the Tembusu Forum is our flagship event, convened about twice a semester by our rector, Professor Tommy Koh. It aims to bring informed discussion about important global, regional, and national issues to the college audience, and provides NUS undergraduates with unique access to policymakers, diplomats, and intellectuals in a setting that encourages the exchange of ideas and opinions. Last semester, at our last Tembusu Forum, we held a mock US presidential debate and ended the session by overwhelmingly electing ex-Senator Hillary Clinton as the next president of the United States of America. Tonight, we are gathered together again, in some ways to understand how we, like so many others, could have gotten it so wrong. Tonight's topic, the rise of populism, seems not only timely, but prevalent, cutting across national and global fronts. To speak more on the topic and to introduce the speakers for tonight, I'd like to now call on Professor Tommy Koh to the stage. Prof. Koh, please.
Thank you, Margaret. I would like to join Margaret in welcoming all of you to the 21st Tembusu Forum. The topic this evening, as she said, is the rise of populism. The master of the college, Professor Gregory Clancy, is unwell, so he's not able to join us this evening. A few weeks ago, Professor Clancy, Dr. Tan, and I had a meeting to decide on what topic should we have for the 21st Forum. And the three of us thought, let's organize a forum to understand better this phenomenon that we're seeing in Europe and the United States, the rise of populism. So the purpose of the forum this evening is for us to have a better understanding on this political phenomenon, the rise of populism, and the implications of this rise for Singapore and for the world. Populism is usually defined as a politician advocating or purporting to advocate the views and interests of the ordinary people. This is in contrast to the elite and to the establishment. If we were surprised by the outcome of the US election, we were also surprised by the outcome of the referendum in the United Kingdom. I remember those of us who followed such matters closely, all of us had relied on the pollster, the polling organizations, and on the pundits, and all of them predicted that the British electorate will vote to remain, although by a rather narrow margin. So the outcome of the referendum in the United Kingdom was a surprise. It contravened the polls, it contravened the pundits. The question I want to ask Jonathan Darby is whether or not the result of the referendum in the United Kingdom is a result of the rise of populism in the United Kingdom. We saw in the United Kingdom a cleavage between the urban voters and the rural voters. We saw a cleavage between people who are well-educated and people who are less well-educated. We saw a cleavage between people who saw immigration as a boon and others who saw it as a threat. We saw a difference between people who welcome globalization and free trade and others who saw it as a threat. Then, in November last year, we watched almost every day the campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And as in the case of the referendum in the United Kingdom, all the polling organizations, all the pundits predicted, even the day before the election, that Hillary Clinton will win the election. All of us got it wrong again. So the question I want to ask my good friend Frank Lavin is, were you surprised yourself? Was the outcome of the election in America, like the referendum in UK, again the result of the rise of populism? We have three very good speakers this evening, and I will introduce them one at a time. Beginning with our first speaker, Jonathan Darby, who just arrived in Singapore a month ago and has a very interesting career. He's a lawyer by training. Before joining the Foreign Service, he was in the telecom industry, and then he joined the Foreign Service. He had a posting in Chicago with a consulate in the United Kingdom consulate in Chicago. And then he took a 5-year leave of absence to work for the government of the state of Victoria in Australia. Very interesting career. So Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us this evening. You have the floor for the next 15 minutes.
Well, firstly, am I speaking in the microphone, I think, is the most important issue of the evening. Firstly, I would like to thank you very much indeed for this invitation to be here tonight, and particularly to Dr. Tan and Professor Koh for your very kind introductions. The sort of theme of my remarks tonight are around the idea of keeping our eyes on the big picture and delivering good governance, prosperity, and security for all. But then the poster that is behind me advertising tonight's event included a picture that came from London, and that's interesting, as is Professor Koh's remarks and asking about the referendum. So I thought I'd start by considering what populism actually means. Then I'll look at the UK's decision to leave the European Union and ask if indeed that was a populist decision. So what is populism? Politicians across the world are labelled as populist. Ideas that range from those of the extreme left and the far right are labelled as populist. And movements throughout time have been labelled as populist. The best definition of populism that I've found is from Cass Moody, who is a political scientist at the University of Georgia in the United States. And in his view, populism is a thin ideology. Because I think what we are talking tonight about is not being leaders being in touch with the people, but the term, when the term populist is used as a criticism, as a denigration of somebody's ideas. And this thin ideology can be attached to all sorts of thick ideologies, such as socialism, nationalism, anti-imperialism, or racism, in order to explain the world and justify specific agendas. The UK's decision last year to leave the European Union has been labelled as a decision born of populism. And it's true to say that some of those campaigners who campaigned for leave used populist arguments. But to ascribe the decision purely to populism would be an act of populist analysis. Some who voted to leave had never supported Britain's membership of the EU. And some had weighed up the advantages and disadvantages and decided that they were going to, on balance, would vote for leave. And to illustrate this point, I thought I'd mention Dennis Healey, who was the Secretary of State for Defence under the Labour government of the 70s, and a great friend of both Singapore and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Now, Dennis Healey campaigned for the UK to join the European Economic Community, as it was then called, in 1973, and he fought many, many battles within the Labour Party to retain that party's commitment to EU membership. But writing in his autobiography, he would talk about the difficulty he had in reconciling the different political traditions within European countries, the tension between a country like the UK with a common law system of government, with an unwritten constitution, and then partners who had a codified system of Roman law and would address issues and reach decisions in a very different way. And in a 2013 interview with the New Statesman magazine, Healy reflected on how the EU had changed since he was in frontline politics. And he said that were there to be a referendum now, he would vote to leave. So are we seeing a rise of populism in the UK? And so to return to Cass Moody, he argued that while most writers deplore populism, the upside is that it lies and it forces those in power to discuss issues that they might otherwise prefer to ignore. Now, I read with interest Professor Koh's Guide to a Confusing World. I recommend it. The pace of change, increasing sense of uncertainty where entire industries disappear, rendered obsolete, groups in society see their status threatened or even just, again, evaporate. This is fertile ground for thin solutions. So whatever the reason for the Brexit vote, the UK government must have had an advanced sight of Professor Koh's guide, and they followed his advice, which is to stick to certain values and principles that have served us well in the past, rather than fall foul of thin answers. So going to Theresa May, who is now our Prime Minister, when she launched her campaign for the leadership of the Conservative Party, she set out, and I'm quoting here, a bold new vision for the future of our country, a vision of a country that works not just for a privileged few, but for every one of us. And then she went on to say, speaking to her party and reminding it of the issues it needed to consider, this is a moment of great national change, and we must rise to the occasion. This is a different kind of conservatism, I know. It marks a break with the past, but it is in fact completely consistent with conservative principles, because we don't just believe in markets, but in communities. We don't just believe in individualism, but in society. And we don't hate the state, we value the role that the state can play. We believe that everybody, not just the privileged few, has a right to take ownership of what matters in their lives. We believe that every generation of politicians, of business leaders, of us all, are custodians with a responsibility to pass on something better to the next generation. And then when she actually won that election and took up office, and entering Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister, she spoke directly to those people who felt confused. If you're from an ordinary working-class family, life is much harder than many people in Westminster realise. If you're just managing, I want to address you directly. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. We will do everything we can to give you more control over your lives. When we take the big calls, we will not think of the powerful, but you. When we pass new laws, we will not listen to the mighty, but you. When it comes to taxes, we will prioritise not just the wealthy, but you. When it comes to opportunity, we won't entrench the advantage of the fortunate few. We will do everything we can to help anybody, whatever your background, go as far as your talents will take you. And we will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us. Now, as Professor Koh said, I've been in Singapore for less than a month, so I'm hesitant to make reference to Singaporean politics for fear that my knowledge would be too superficial, perhaps even populist. But perhaps you could consider the words of Theresa May then to the soul-searching that PM Lee said that he was going to undertake after the 2011 general election. Now, Theresa May set out her vision for the UK in a speech in January of this year, which she entitled A Plan for Britain. And again, she emphasised that we will use this moment of change to build a stronger economy and a fairer society by embracing genuine economic and social reform. Now, my technological ability prevented me bringing slides tonight, but what I was wanting to have was a Wordle picture of her speech, which showed that continually throughout the different topics that she mentioned, such as the development of a modern industrial strategy, school reform, investment in economic infrastructure, and she continually emphasised that the result of the referendum was not a decision to turn inward and retreat from the world, but it was a decision to stand higher, more broadly across the world, as in a global Britain. Because just as the language of a populist can corrupt thought and stoke fear and fan uncertainty, the Prime Minister has sought in her speeches to seek the opposite. She emphasised Britain's history and culture as a profoundly internationalist history and culture, that we're a European nation proud of our shared European heritage, but we're also a country that has looked beyond Europe to the wider world. She linked the fact that the UK is one of the most racially diverse and most multicultural countries within Europe. And she emphasised the referendum, again and again she emphasised the referendum was not the moment that Britain chose to step back from the world, it was the moment we chose to build a truly global Britain. She detailed in much more detail the sort of objectives that we were wanting to achieve under Brexit, clustering those principles under those things under guiding principles. But they were not introspective, easy fixes to complex problems. She addressed the need for clarity and certainty, recognising that business, individuals, we all need to know where we stand. She emphasised that it was for the British Parliament to decide any changes in the law afterwards. She talked about strengthening Britain, control of our laws, strengthening the union within the United Kingdom, maintaining the common travel area with Ireland. And the third, and again, returning to that point of speaking to the people who were unhappy, who were feeling confused. The principle of the fairer Britain, ensuring this is fair to everyone who lives and works in this country, control of immigration, rights of the EU nationals in Britain and British nationals who live in the EU, and protecting workers' rights. And the Prime Minister held up as a great prize for the UK the opportunity ahead to use this moment to build a truly global Britain, reaching out to old friends and new allies, a great global trading nation, and one of the firmest advocates of free trade anywhere in the world, looking for free trade within Europe, but also new trade arrangements within other countries, making the UK one of the best places in the world for science and innovation, and maintaining cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism. And she set out a very smooth and orderly process for in which this to be done. There's been a lot of analysis of the UK's referendum decision. Many column inches have been written and airtime hours filled with people putting forward their proposals as to why. So my suggestion to you this evening is that instead of comparing different strands of speculation and commentary and building our own thoughts on the musings of others, we should perhaps return to the source material, what the Prime Minister actually said. And we'll see that her eyes are fixed on delivering the big picture of delivering good governance, prosperity and security for everybody in the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like now to introduce our second speaker, who's a very good friend, Ambassador Frank Lavin, who had served with great distinction in the U.S. Department of Commerce, in the National Security Council, in the White House, and here in Singapore as the U.S. Ambassador for 4 years. And during those 4 important years, the two countries, United States and Singapore, were negotiating a free trade agreement. And I want to use this opportunity to thank Frank for the good advice he gave to the two delegations, which enabled us to close the negotiation and to conclude a very good agreement. Since leaving the government service, Frank has worked in the private sector, based both in Hong Kong and in Singapore. He had worked for Edelman, Citibank, Bank of America. He is currently in Singapore, not gainfully employed, but as the spouse of his talented wife, Anne, who works for Google. So I want to introduce Frank as a lucky man who's living on the moral earnings of his wife. Frank, come and explain to us what's going on in your country.
Thank you, Tommy, for that very gracious introduction. I have to tell you, I have to confess, I always get a little worried when you compliment me so, particularly for the FTA assistance, because I think what you're really saying in a very polite way is I was compliant, that I was a very malleable ambassador and basically did what you wanted, so I get high praise. But in any event, we ended up with a good treaty. We ended up with a very good treaty, right? I don't think I deserve any particular credit for it, but we should all be very pleased with the outcome and what it's done for it. Thank you for hosting us tonight, Tommy. Margaret, Professor Tan, thank you for all of your help and support tonight as well. And Jonathan, thank you for your remarks. An excellent way to kick off. Yeah, I'm going to try to focus my remarks, not surprisingly, from a U.S. context, but I want to try to do it abstractly to discuss the phenomenon. And then we can take it into particulars. But I think unless you understand the phenomenon and what drives it, then the analysis risks becoming really a statement of preferences or likes or don't likes and so forth. So to keep away from that. So what I'd say up front is, I think Jonathan gave us a very good overview of this phenomenon of populism as a global phenomenon, and we see it acutely, I think, with the election of Donald Trump in the United States. But largely because of his particular personality and his operating style, I think he tends to get underestimated. So my suggestion is we put aside that personal preference and view of him as an individual for a minute and look at the phenomenon as political scientists. And I want to suggest two lines of analysis. One, what are the characteristics of political populism? And secondly, what gave it potency in 2016? And I'll begin with a historical story. I'll take you back a few decades. 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, we could argue that the most famous woman in the world might have been Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife. She was the wife of a president and the niece of another president, and Mrs. Roosevelt had also established a public identity in her own right as mass media came to the forefront. She was a known public figure in her own right. In May of 1935, though, she did something that my reading of history tells me no woman in America had ever done. She went into a coal mine. And press reports tell us that she traveled 2 miles into a coal seam. She spent 90 minutes meeting and talking with some 400 miners, discussing safety conditions, pay, mining techniques. And not surprisingly, Mrs. Roosevelt's willingness to connect with the miners in this kind of environment met with widespread acclaim. Now we'll take you ahead 81 years to 2016. The most famous woman in the world was arguably Hillary Clinton. She visited coal country in May of 2016. She didn't go into a mine, which I think is more scheduling matter than anything else, but she held a town hall meeting with the miners. Most famously at that meeting was her statement, quote, "We are going to put a lot of coal miners and coal companies out of business." Now, it's a jarring comment, to put it mildly, if you're a coal miner coming to hear someone who is running for office. And I have to put this in context, that Mrs. Clinton gave this statement as she's trying to promote a transition to green energy. And she subsequently apologized for her comment. But the damage is done if you go to a group of people and say, "I'm working to put you out of business." I mean, they tend to believe you. So in 1936, Franklin Roosevelt received 61% of the vote in West Virginia, right? I think a very strong round of applause for this. 80 years later, 2016, Hillary Clinton received 26. So it went from 61% to 26%. Now, this is my jumping off point for populism. And I said I want to begin by defining populism. And I see 4 characteristics of populism. And the first one, as illustrated in the previous story, is the populist must have emotional connectivity with the audience. And what's important, we can have a longer discussion on this, but what is important, and I think what flummoxes a lot of people, is this connectivity need not be class-based. There need not be a class dimension to it, right? So Eleanor Roosevelt, quite a patrician background, quite a privileged background, established connectivity with working people. Donald Trump, an affluent person, established connectivity with working people. So I think you can get mixed up if you look at it slowly through a class lens. So first is emotional connectivity. Second, and Jonathan touched on this point, populism has a strong grievance tradition. It is frequently grievance-based. It focuses on problems rather than solutions. Third, it is exculpatory. The problems we have been caused by others. The audience is blameless. And similarly, in the same vein, Others are not merely wrong, but they're usually malevolent. And this is frequently expressed in themes that are anti-establishment or themes of alienation. Fourth point of populism is that policy choices are cost-free. There are no trade-offs. Don't worry about cost-benefit analysis. Don't worry about transition costs. Don't worry about challenges in running a government program. Don't worry about underperforming programs, and don't worry about unintended consequences. There are problems, and I've got the solution, right? This is a distilled essence of populism. Those, I think, are general conditions of populism. And look, depending on the magnitude and the context and the weight and so forth with others, I think you can see in public life that some of these can be positively expressed and some can be negatively expressed. I think what's interesting in 2016, and I think it's somewhat uncharacteristic, is that we had two major candidates whose campaign embraced, I think, all four of those elements to some extent. Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right, or less. So this brings me to the second level of analysis. How did this come about? What drives populism? I mean, if it's a tendency of human nature, it should be persistent and constant throughout all elections, right? But why did it seem to accelerate in the US this year? And probably some of these points apply to the UK as well and elsewhere. First, I would say the combination of globalization and automation. And it creates, if not winners and losers, it does create a distribution effect. And if it doesn't necessarily create inequality, it certainly creates a perception of inequality. And as we were talking about at dinner, if the bell curve of income, the bell curve in good times doesn't shift, the bell curve of income distribution doesn't shift. People don't get prosperous at an equal rate. The bell curve stretches. Some people are going to run faster than others. So even when there's general prosperity or technological innovation or trade improvement, some people are better positioned to take care of it. So it's not so much that there are losers, there might be some, but it's that you have unequal distribution, you have an elongation of the distribution curve. And I'd say globalization also feeds into a sense of alienation because people at least perceive they have less control in their own lives. Second driver of populism, I think a shift in American political culture from growth economics to grievance economics. Growth economics was the dominant economic mode, I think, of policy formulation in the 1950s and 1960s as the country went through post-war recovery and people were focusing on simply creating a prosperous country. The primary driver of policy formulation is just what gets us the highest rates of growth. Of course, the premise of that kind of policy, it's not a bad policy, I would say, but the premise is that the system is fundamentally fair. So the only question we have to face as policymakers is how fast can we run, right? If it's fair, let's run as fast as we can. The premise of grievance economics is the system has a lot of unfairness in it. It might be fundamentally unfair. So if you run faster, you're just reinforcing the unfairness. What's the point of running faster, right? If our fundamental goal here is inequality, and all you're going to do through automation or globalization or other kind of is reward certain groups of people, you're just generating more inequality. But I think there's a cumulative price the body politic pays for this approach to policy. I think if you focus on growth economics, you get growth. If you focus on grievance economics, you get grievances. A third point is, I would say, there is a shift in the US international posture. There's been a growing fatigue in the US over the cost of leadership. I think the US entered the post-Cold War era with the institutions and the cohesion of the Cold War era largely intact, even though the collapse of the Soviet Union removed what political scientists would term a negative integrator. Now we are deep into the post-Cold War era with faded cohesion and institutions. And Americans seem more sensitive to the indirect cost of public opinion, such as public opinion and anti-Americanism. I can sum up this shift. You could say an international decision maker, a president has to decide whether to be a minute early or a minute late. Being a minute early means leadership. Means you're taking actions when there's not a consensus or not necessarily a perceived threat, but you're moving, right? But there's a cost to leadership. There's a cost to action without a consensus, and there's always the possibility of error. Now, being a minute late, waiting until the problem has materialized, has the extraordinary advantage of a consensus being ready-made. So it's much less expensive in a political sense. But potentially, being a minute late is actually more expensive over the long run. If you say, my view of foreign policy is we don't need to think about getting in front of problems, let's just wait till whatever problems appear, then we'll go tackle them. Potentially, that gives you a more expensive foreign policy in the long run. In the short run, it probably saves you money. On the fourth point in the rise of populism, I would say is the rise of identity politics. That the social contract in any successful polity means leadership has to provide for the public goods, education, national defense, impartial administration of justice. If the government is perceived as favoring or disfavoring a group, it risks ill will, and I think more corrosively, it provides a justification for other groups to clamor. So instead of people seeking a common good, they seek rewards for their group. And this is very much in contrast with the traditional melting pot view of social integration, which is normally fostered in the US. Now, is this shift exacerbated by globalization? I think in any event, this debate, this sense of identity politics very much contributes to a populist appeal that is anti-immigrant, anti-terrorist, even anti-trade, because I think much of the debate is really about national identity and the harm putatively caused by others. Finally, this takes us back to my initial historical example. I would say the appeal of populism is driven somewhat by limitations or failures of the leadership class. Sometimes insular, sometimes rigid, sometimes simply mediocre. Sometimes it's over-engineered solutions, and the appearance maybe of not being corrupt, at least being self-serving. Sometimes it's the declining marginal effectiveness of government programs as society becomes more affluent and complicated. But regardless, polling data tells us that American leadership institutions are viewed at near historical lows. The elites, especially politicians and journalists, are perceived to have lost touch with the general population. Now, if elites cannot maintain that connectivity, they give an opening to populists. Is Davos the solution, or is Davos the problem? For all of his wealth and celebrity status, Trump is not a member of the Davos Club. Indeed, I believe it fair to say that much of the US political and intellectual establishment would hold him in contempt. Now, we're discussing 2016. I think we can say beyond policy analysis, there's a lot of technical analysis that comes into play. The digital communications revolution we've heard about. There's an enormous body of literature about Donald Trump did this better or Hillary Clinton did this worse. I'm sure there's a lot of validity to the technical analysis. I can sum up, though, what I think were the salient points, that Trump is a man of unusual presentation strengths. He very effectively projects personality. And I think we also have to say that Trump was an exemplary grievance candidate in a grievance year. Trump articulated a vision, Hillary Clinton did not. And I think Trump used communications more effectively. We're in a communications era. I think Hillary Clinton is a kind of very bright, very capable political leader who believes in her inbox. Trump believes in his outbox. He found the emotional pulse of the nation and, or as part of the nation, and he echoed those concerns. So Hillary always campaigned as the functionary, Donald Trump as the visionary. I'm going to wrap up. Margaret's going to be happy. I'm wrapping up. I'm going to take you back into history again to wrap up, but not to 1935. I'll take you back 2,200 years earlier in the 2nd century Rome, BCE. And a very young member of the Scipio family, I have to read this, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasia, was a candidate for a diet, which is one of the magistrates in Rome responsible for public building, games, and importation of corn. And we are told this story by the historian Verlius. Scipio is shaking hands as he's running for office, and he encounters a farmer with hands apparently quite rough from field work. Well, my goodness, Scipio jokes, do you walk on them? Well, the joke fell flat because the farmers, some of whom overheard it, farmers inferred that this young aristocrat was denigrating them or mocking their rough ways. And Scipio lost the election. So these stories remind us of the aphorism, which I think is perhaps the essence of populism. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I don't know whether it is possible to describe a political leader who basically ran on a grievance agenda as a visionary. You said Hillary Clinton is a functionary and Donald Trump is a visionary. So I'm not sure whether it's the right way to describe Donald, but we'll take you on later on. What is very puzzling for many Singaporeans is that a person who's anti so many things could still get elected. I mean, he's anti-immigration, anti-free trade, anti-globalization, anti-LGBT rights, anti-Islam, and yet he has a passionate core constituency. And so he tapped into something, some special mood in America. I want to now switch your focus from England, from America to Singapore. And the question is, are we immune from populism? One of my colleagues at the Institute of Policy Study, Dr. Gillian Koh, said that the 2011 general election in Singapore was a mini Brexit. And I wonder whether our next speaker, Professor Tan Eun-seo, would agree with Gillian. I want to briefly introduce this good friend of mine. Eun-seo is one of my favorite sociologists in Singapore. I used to boast in America that Singapore is a classless society, that there are no classes here. We are all equal. But Eun-seo proved me wrong. In the year 2004, he published a book called Does Class Matter? And his point is that Singapore is becoming increasingly stratified. Then in 2015, he published another book called Class and Social Orientations. So Eun-seo is the right person to join us this evening to try to explain to us whether we have experienced populism in Singapore in 2011, or is there a danger of populism coming to our shores? Eun-seo, please.
Well, good evening, everybody. After the introduction, I think I have to live up to your expectation, right? Okay, I must say that Prof. Tommy Koh have been very encouraging in my career all these years. I first emerged, I think, in 1989, where we were in some kind of press conference, right? And after the press conference, Prof. Tommy Koh told me that I think I looked too stern, right? I don't really remember saying that. And so since then, I tried to lighten up a bit. Okay, I hope I'll be successful tonight, right? Okay, as you can see, being a teacher, a professor at the university, right? I'm so dependent on PowerPoint. And very often I try to speak like Prof. Tommy Koh and off the cuff, right? But I've not been successful in that regard. So back to my PowerPoint, and hopefully the points will come with my power, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do is to talk about the sources and the consequences of populism in Singapore. And then as what Prof. Tommy Koh cited, one of my other colleague, Gillian Koh, who argued that we have our Brexit moment, but maybe we can also describe it as our populism moment, right? And that was sometime in the GE 2011, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. It's only happened like 5 years ago, right? So let me just go on through the slides that I have, and hopefully I can take out 15 minutes. You know, one of my problems is that sometimes I'm so brief that I don't take out 15 minutes. So this time I'm going to be not so brief, okay? Well, I have two pictures that I downloaded from the internet, and that reflects our populism moment. All right, that was sometime, I think, just before 2011, where people were like, there are a lot of people who are actually quite activist and quite volatile about how they feel about government programs, government policies. And so on the left, you find this picture that happens at Hong Lim Park, or our Speaker's Corner, right? Where you have people saying Singapore for Singaporeans, very much like what's happening in the United States. And then on the right side, we have another picture, and this one says waiting for 2016. I believe 2016 was what they thought the election is going to be, right? It was actually turned out to be 2015. But at the time, they were thinking that, okay, by 2016, we're going to elect a new government. So something like that happened. Okay, so let me go on to the various slides I have. And first of all, let me just try to deal with the meaning of populism in Singapore, right? There might be some overlap with what the two previous speakers have covered about populism, but let me give my own interpretation of what populism is like in Singapore. All right, first of all, I think there is a segment, I'm not sure how big it is, but it turned out to be not that big after all, but they're very loud, very volatile, and highly visible, right? And this segment of population feel that their rice bowl and hope for the future, including that of their children, are threatened, and producing a strong sense of insecurity, all right? So they felt threatened and they felt insecure. And the culprit they have in mind, and you notice that I put it as culprit 1A and 1B because I don't want to use 1 and 2, right? Because I think both are equally important. So it's culprit 1A and 1B. All right, culprit 1A is the government, they blame the government for opening the floodgate, leading to intense competition for jobs, amenities, space, and infrastructure. And culprit 1B would be the foreigners blamed for taking away high-paying jobs, as well as keeping their wages low and stagnant. So the characteristics of populism in Singapore look something like this: a strong feeling of insecurity, and thereby leading to no generosity of spirit, a fear of downward mobility, and belief that there's no trade-off to banning immigration. You know that our government has always been talking about trade-off, right? But I think these people believe that there's no trade-off. We just ban immigration and our problems will be solved. And they are extremely angry at the government and others perceived to be its supporter. Actually, I'm not really a supporter, but sometimes when I make comments in the press, I notice that I get attacked for being a supporter. In fact, I think there was one recent entry that says that, am I trying to join the PAP? I hereby declare that I'm not, okay? Okay, but anyway, I was branded in some way, like in a small way, that I'm one of the PAP supporter and in the social media. Okay, and they also believe that the opposition can help to reverse foreigner-friendly policy. Right? That's what populism looks like in Singapore. All right, so what are the sources of populism in Singapore? Let me take you sort of historically, right, to the late 70s. The late 70s is the time of double-digit growth. You know, at the time we're talking about 11%, 12%, right? So those were very good times, and everyone was enjoying themselves, you know, with increment and so on and so forth. And that was a time where we saw the emergence of the Singapore dream. You know, the US have the American dream, right? We have the Singapore dream. So what is the Singapore dream all about? In fact, I will also argue that it looks a bit like a game, you know. There's a mobility game here, and every Singaporean is playing that mobility game. And this mobility game involves, it's all about upgrading, it's all about asset enhancement, and I think when PM Go talk about asset enhancement, I think that didn't really help, okay? But at the time, it was okay, because everyone was sort of very serious about upgrading. And people were, you know, all caught up with trying to achieve middle-class status, and of course, the very famous 5 Cs, right? You know what it means, right? Cash, condominium, car, and credit card, and country card membership. All right, so if you want to play the game, and many people were playing the game, right? Playing the game means, number one, do well in school, secure a high-paying job, purchase a car, and an HDB apartment, and eventually crossing the divide from public to private housing. I think that's what is involved. And since the late 80s, unfortunately, we have economic turbulence and downturns. And then from 1990 to 2010, the population increased by 1 million people. All right, that's a lot of people. You know that right now our population is something like, I think it's 5.5 or 5.6, right? And about a third, 36%, I think, are foreigners. Okay, so all these lead to a disruption of the mobility game. I think that is probably the first disruption we're talking about. I know right now we're talking about technological disruption, but at the time it was the disruption of the mobility game, which I have outlined earlier. So I thought maybe one way to try to, characterize what's happening about populism is, why don't we refer to the lyrics of the Beatles of yesterday, right? And you know, of course, the Beatles was sort of my time. When I was growing up, it was the Beatles, right? I think when it was Prof. Koh's time, probably Elvis. Could be, yeah. So anyway, yesterday, right? So I just pick out a few lines from the song, and it says, yesterday, all my troubles seemed so far away, all right? Now it looks as though they are here to stay, and then blah, 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 right? And suddenly, I'm not half the man I used to be. There's a shadow hanging over me. And yesterday, mobility was such an easy game to play, right? Remember I was talking about mobility game, right? So it's not easy to play anymore, and I'm sure all of you felt the same way, right? Used to be that when you embark on education, you do well for PSLE, O-level, A-level, and you think you're all set. But right now, you don't feel the same way. There's an anxiety there that the game is not the same anymore. So what are the consequences? Let me just move straight away to 2011, right? So there was anger directed at the PAP government and against foreigners, including new citizens. Right, that's number one. And the GE 2011 reflects that mood of anger among that segment of Singaporeans. And you notice that at the time, the PAP was quite reluctant to harp on its track record. You know, in past elections, right, the PAP always talk about its track record, but in 2011, it sort of toned down on its track records because nobody cares, all right? Forget about the past. We're talking about the now and the future, right? And even at that, in that 2011 election, you notice that PM Lee actually apologized for the mistakes made. You know, in the past, it's always about, we did so well, right, all these years. So, but in 2011, it was apologizing for mistakes made. And also, there was a record attendance at opposition rallies. You notice the picture there I downloaded for internet, right? The one on the left, you know, is WP, right? And the one on the right is the PAP, all right? So it's quite clear that people were gravitating to those kind of rallies in 2011. And so after the election, the score was 60-40, which actually by American standard is not bad. It actually would be a landslide victory, right? But in Singapore, it was felt to be quite bad, okay, 60-40. And at that time, of course, we know that the WP won a GRC, including keeping Hougang, right? And then subsequently, in the by-election, it even won Punggol East, right? Okay, so, and academics were all starting to talk about the arrival of the new normal. I don't think we hear them very much now, but certainly at the time, everyone was talking about the arrival of the new normal. And subsequently, I thought I want to mention this because there was the formation of a new political party with a name like Singaporean First. Sounds very much like the US, right? Yeah. So, but that was in 2014, but subsequently, you know that in the 2015 election, they didn't do too well, right? Yeah. Okay, but the name is sort of catchy, Singaporean First. All right, between 2011 and GE 2015, right, the PAP government put in tremendous effort to fix the GE 2011 hot button issues. I mean, like immigration, housing, transport, healthcare, education, and then so-called strengthening the Singaporean core, right? And also, they spend a lot of time on public consultation. I mean, some of you might have been involved in the OSC, right, our Singapore Conversation, isn't it? I think about something like, was it 4,000 or 40,000 people were involved, right? Maybe more like 4,000. And then there was also a lot of emphasis on public communications. All right, so Channel 8 TV, for example, you find a lot of this song and dance, right, with a touch of humor. You know that our government is quite reluctant to use dialect, right, but after 2011, it seems to be quite willing to use it for public communication purposes. And even the use of Chinese dialects in some of these TV programs, right? All right, so GE 2015 came, and the PAP got a strong mandate. It's got a score of about 70, a ratio of 70 to 30, right? And the PAP was rewarded for addressing the hot button issues. It also benefited from the participation of weak opposition parties, achieving scores close to 80-20 in those wards. So even though we think that it is all the PAP doing that, but actually it's also because some of those constituencies have very weak opposition parties, right? And Singapore First is actually one of them, the one that I mentioned earlier. All right, so moving along, yeah. So why no populist effect in Singapore? Well, actually, there was, all right? There was anger, enormous anger in that segment of the population. But then I have to also argue that I think there's no significant polarization in Singapore. I mean, unlike the US, you notice that it's sort of split down half, right? Maybe in the UK, it's also split about half. But in Singapore, you have angry people, but there's no real serious polarization. And there was no serious intention to kick out the PAP. Anyway, it wasn't possible. But neither was there any serious intention to do so, right? But they wanted to put pressure on the PAP in the form of a stronger opposition presence, right? So they want opposition in parliament to, put pressure on the PAP so that it will be always on its toes, right? So in any case, the opposition isn't seen as capable of taking over. And I really believe that there's still trust in the PAP's stewardship, all right, unlike elsewhere in the world, right? And the PAP government has a good track record of steering the economy through treacherous waters in the past. And since GE 2015, the PAP government has convinced most people that immigration, now they have calibrated the inflow, right, isn't the problem. The real problem is actually global competition and the disruption caused by advancement in digital technology, all right? So in other words, it was able to convince the people that, immigration isn't a problem. It isn't a problem. Of course, we have to calibrate it a little bit, but the real problem is actually what's happening in the rest of the world, right? In terms of trade, in terms of globalization, in terms of the challenge that's brought forth by digital technology. Okay, so the implication here, I'm almost done. I think to keep Singapore great always, to borrow something from Donald Trump, right? Number one is that Singaporeans must be treasured and given opportunities to excel. All right, we can't just take people for granted. We can't just keep on praising our foreign talent and forget that we have a big constituency of Singaporeans, okay? So Singaporeans must be treasured. And number two, it takes the different contribution of Singaporeans and foreigners in our midst to keep Singapore great. All right, it's not just Singapore core alone, but Singapore together with the foreigners that we brought into our midst. And the government must recognize and harness the contribution of Singaporeans, not undervalue it. Because sometimes we tend to take Singaporeans for granted, right? And we just say, oh, we brought in this great guy, right? And he's doing such a good job contributing to Singapore. But let's not forget the people in Singapore who are actually doing pretty well, right? We should recognize it. And calling foreign professionals foreign talent and claiming they are winning Olympic medals as our own has not gone down well. Yeah, I'm sure you recall there's one National Day rally, right, where PMD actually had a phone call with Li Jiawei and the table tennis team, and then celebrating it as our success. I don't think that went down well. I'm sure you agree with me on that. So I think the future lies with creating a good synergy between Singaporeans and the foreigners in our midst. And then I can't help but got to bring this in, right? As we move from the glory days of Li Jiawei and Fen Tianwei to that of Joseph Schooling, right, one can't help noticing that Singaporeans were sympathetic when Feng got into trouble with the Table Tennis Association. In those days, there were a lot of toxic remarks about Li Jiawei and so on and so forth. But how is it that when Feng got into trouble with STTA, actually there were a lot of sympathetic people? So I think the problem is not really immigration. The problem is anger directed at the PAP government, all right? And anyway, I'm happy to say that I think since then, I think the spirit of generosity is back again in Singapore. And I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
We have come to our Q&A session. There are microphones set up on either side of the hall. Please identify yourself first before you ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Before opening the floor for questions from the audience, I would like to introduce a good friend who's here and to persuade him to share with us some wise words. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Jürgen Müller, who served with many years as the Danish ambassador to Singapore. After he retired from After he retired from the Danish Foreign Service, he has stayed on in Singapore and is a senior research fellow at the Institute Southeast Asian Study, a visiting professor at SMU, and also a professor at the Copenhagen Business School. Jørgen, please.
Thank you very much. The microphone works? Yeah. Let me start by recalling The Simpsons. I'm sure you know this wonderful comic strip on television. There's one episode that concentrates on exactly this populism and globalization. And the company where Homer works calls a meeting, and they have all heard rumors about outsourcing, offshoring, job losses. So they fear the worst. And the chief executive officer goes on and explains what is going on in the company, and he approaches also the question of outsourcing, and they all sit there very scared, afraid. What does it mean for me? And then he finishes by saying, don't worry, your job is safe. Oh, Homer and all his colleagues draw a sigh of relief, whereafter the chief executive officer continues, only it will be done by somebody else. The core of populism is uncertainty, followed by instability and insecurity. And right now, in the United States and Europe, we have a cocktail that is turning toxic. And it is composed by capitalism that is running wild without any barriers for aberrations and distortions, by globalization that questions people's identity. Who are we? Migrants are coming in, and we will have to move abroad to get a job. And technology that through robots removes a lot of jobs. This is too much for a large part, not the majority, but a large part of the population. They can't stomach it anymore. They can't take it anymore. They have voted for the opposition, but when the opposition came into power, it adopted exactly the same policy as the government. So what do they do now? They vote for outsiders. They have nothing to lose. Why not give Trump a chance? Why not give Brexit a chance? Why not try it? Why not build a wall to Mexico? Why not start a trade war with China? Why not try it? We have tried everything else. We are social losers. The core of this is that preferences are shifting, not among all people. It's wrong to talk about the people here, but preferences are shifting among such a large share of the population that it needs to be taken into account. And the message is, we want a pause for reflection. We want to digest. We want to know whether this is really the way we want to go. So stop a moment and let's see what is going on. And unless we, the establishment, the elite, actually understands this, I fear it will go awfully wrong. Because we will have to realize that these preferences between gross material well-being, consumption on the one hand, and uncertainty, insecurity on the other hand, is actually a factor that has come to stay. My final remark at this is that it's revealing when you look at the opinion polls from the former Soviet Union and some of the Central and Eastern European countries, including former East Germany, about how people feel today. A large proportion of the population actually answers, we long for the good old days back when we had the communist system. That's difficult for us to understand, at least for me. But the reason they give It's very simple. Back to the core. In those days, we knew where we were. We had a secure job. Living standard may have been lower, but we had a secure job. We could go to the doctor. Everything was predictable. And that was actually for us a better life, even if the GDP per capita was lower. We speak a language they find difficult to understand. I suppose that our British friend there have heard the story, but there is a story from the campaign about Brexit where a pro-Remain person is talking and actually advocating Remain. And he says that, well, if you look at it, the GDP per capita will be much higher if, and then he's interrupted by somebody from the room who shouts back, stuck in your arsehole, excuse me for saying so, stuck in your arsehole, your damn GDP, it is not ours. This is the problem.
I thank Jürgen for your contribution. Your point is that people feel insecure. This is true everywhere in the world. But we can't stop the world, you know. We can't stop globalization. You can't stop technology. You can't stop the digital economy, e-commerce, and so on. So what's the solution? Yes.
I want to thank all the speakers for really interesting presentations, each one focusing on a slightly different aspect of this problem that seems to be sweeping across the globe, and other places that we haven't talked about, like the possibilities in France now, or in Holland, and even Germany, and elsewhere. But so far, and this has been the frustration throughout the American election, we're really good at analyzing the problem. And we just heard a very eloquent repetition of the analysis of the problem. So I want to reinforce the question that Prof. Koh just ended with. Where do people see solutions coming from? Now, I may have misheard Ambassador Lavin when you seemed to indicate that one of the directions, let's say, that the United States is moving is a kind of pullback to nationalism, which of course is the argument that Bannon, the man behind the throne in the United States, is arguing. He makes a very clear argument that he's not a white nationalist, that he's not a white supremacist, but he is an economic nationalist. The dismissal of Bernie Sanders on the left as somehow an equivalent populist to Trump on the right, I think does an injustice to the enormous contribution that Sanders made to the political discourse in the United States, which is to put on the agenda so that people talk about it, even if he didn't win, questions of the common good, questions of social justice, questions of, as Mr. Darby put it, I thought really well, and Singapore can give us some guidance, perhaps, on what is called good governance. So I'd like to hear a little bit from all three speakers, perhaps, about how they see where these social forces are going and where solutions might come from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think let's take two more questions, then I'll turn to the three panelists. May I have another question? Yes, please. Can you introduce yourself? And
Hi, thank you, Mr. Koh. My name is David, fourth year. So my question is more in regards to, I guess, firstly, Mr. Darby, because I don't really think like you covered like the angle of the EU actually. I'm not very familiar with the problems within like Britain and what EU faces. I'm not sure. Maybe you could give us a bit more context on that. And I guess
Sorry. What's your first question?
as in, because I feel like there wasn't much. I thought like a lot of the resentment came from the way that they didn't like the populace didn't really like how the EU operated.
Okay. I think the main. Well, I'll let Jonathan reply to this. I think the main grievance by members of the British electorate was that they were against the mobility of people.
Yeah.
Being part of the European Union means your borders are open to the migration of people from other EU member countries. There are 28 members. So as long as you're a member of the EU, your borders have to be open. And I think that caused a lot of resentment in the United Kingdom.
I do agree with that. Which maybe perhaps I should lead on with my second question, which is more like, I guess it's also quite similar to the first question, is that it's the problem about infrastructure, actually, about the way the public management actually works. My feeling is that, just look at Nigel Farage, and he campaigned on the idea that you can actually get $400 million back from NHS, and then you like can fund the NHS, and and he was like giving too much payments, and in the US also one of the big problems was Obamacare, or at least like the perception that it wasn't working as well as they liked, and in both cases there's the idea that they would try to repair this kind of like social welfare payments or the social infrastructure within it. And that's what Singapore did post 2011. So I was wondering, like, maybe perhaps it's just something along the lines of public management.
What's your question?
As in, like, if that is an issue, if that is the true crux of it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Another question. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Buck, Year 1. I would like to first thank all the three speakers for your remarks. I would like to direct my question to Ambassador Lavin. You mentioned in your remarks that one of the reasons why populism is on the rise was because of very low public opinion on the press. We also see during the campaign and in the first month of his administration, Trump has been attacking the press. And we also see this does not come only from Trump, but also from the people from both spectrum of the political spectrum. So my question to you is, what is your prescription for to solve the problem of the press not being in touch with the people? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, one of the main agendas of President Trump seems to be his war with the mainstream media. Yeah? He's used some very strong words. He even described the American media the enemy of the people. So, good question for Frank. So we have three questions. The first question is, we know what the problems are. Are there any solutions? Second question is for you, Jonathan. Why did the British vote to leave the EU? And third, Frank, can you comment on President Trump's war against American media? Start with Jonathan.
Is this me? Yeah. Look, to be honest, if I knew why the British people voted to leave the EU, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd also know which horse was going to win a particular race, which numbers were going to come up on a particular gaming table, and I'd be backing that horse and picking that number. I mean, I think the reason, I don't mean to be flippant, is that it's a really complicated, it wasn't Nigel Farage's arguments that won. it was a coalition of arguments behind Leave that won. Dennis Healey, who sadly passed away before the referendum, but Dennis Healey is about the most un-Nigel Farage-like politician you could ever imagine, an intellectual giant who, but not just an intellectual giant in politics, but the arts, across all sorts of different genres and disciplines. And for a person like him to be saying we should be leaving shows that it was not a unified single campaign.
But my question for you, Jonathan, is why did Dennis Healey in his memoirs say that if he had to vote on the status of UK and the EU, he would vote to leave? What is it about the contemporary EU that he disapproved of?
For him, I think it was an issue that, and I'm going to use a term here which is the easiest way of describing it, is that sort of the European project, the way that the European Union developed from the European Community of 1973, or the European Iron and Steel Federation from the 50s, what it started off and what it has now become. People who supported the initial idea of working together with European countries working together on particular issues, they felt that there was a project to create ever closer political union, which is something that they didn't agree with, and that they felt that decisions being taken from national parliaments and made at a European level, sort of at a supranational level, was diluting, weakening the democracy of countries in Europe. And so the Dennis Healey argument would be that no, this is not how it should be, that Britain should make these decisions ourselves, and it should not be able to be sort of outvoted by other European countries.
Thank you, Jonathan. Frank? President Trump's war against the media.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of found myself agreeing with Jonathan's comments in an answer to the second question, meaning I've never met Donald Trump. I've never spoken with him. I know a fair amount of people in the administration in their sort of government capacity who I keep in contact with. But I have no idea what he's doing. And I guess you'd say there's probably two theories that one could subscribe to, and it probably reflects more about the individual who's subscribing than about Trump. One is that it is pure expediency, that the media is going to be against him anyhow. There's no political cost to punching these guys in the nose. You dominate the story. I mean, it's sort of like we know what movie's going to do well at the Oscars. Any movie about movies will dominate the Oscars, right? That actors and actresses like talking about themselves and like awards. Well, I'll tell you this, any media story about the media will dominate the media. So if you're Donald Trump and you're saying, I'll tell you what I want is I want to be on the front page for next week, you say what he says, right? You dominate the media, they're all responding to you, you're controlling the conversation, all right? So, you know, tactically there's a lot to be said for that. Now, I have no idea if that's what he's doing or not, but you can see the tactical appeal of that. I think a separate theory you could subscribe to is to say, look, ideologically, the editorial pages of the American papers are overwhelmingly on the left, overwhelmingly hostile to him. You know, there's no problem in setting yourself up in an adversarial position to these guys. And because you, Donald Trump, are so effective on the stage, you can control to some event a messaging mechanism that can compete to some extent with established traditional media. So why not just have a go at it? Now, again, I don't know if he sort of stumbled into this or if this was a plan all along or if this is just what he backed into when he started running. My impression when he started running was he himself had no serious thought of winning, but he said, let's just take a flyer on this thing. And he said, I might not be a better president than anybody on the stage, but I'm sure as hell a better performer than anybody on stage. I'm going to dominate the debates. Hillary Clinton's nothing special. I push her around too. I'm going to, you know, see how far I can go with this. So I get the sense that he just has a supreme sense of the moment, that he's not necessarily a very strong political strategist, but he's an extraordinary political tactician, and that he can say there's a moment here that the press doesn't have the weight now that they historically have had. Okay. He's got 90 million followers on social media, right? That's not bad.
So the question I want to ask you, Frank, During the long years I lived in America, the American media, American press, was regarded as a fourth estate, the fourth center of power, in addition to the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, the fourth estate, the media. And the conventional wisdom used to be that the American media is so powerful that it could make you or break you. So is Donald Trump going to prove that we are wrong, that conventional wisdom doesn't apply anymore?
I think, by the way, one of my brothers was a New York Times editor, and now CNN. The other brother was a Wall Street Journal reporter. Anne's father, my father-in-law, was a weekly newspaper publisher. So I'm with you. I said a proper day begins with reading the morning paper, right? And this is how the civilization moves ahead, right? So, but I think you and I are dinosaurs, my friend. I think now I think a proper day begins with finding the angriest person on Twitter and then forwarding it to all of your friends, so we all become angry together. So, I mean, technology just changes patterns of behavior. And I'll say something about America and a national policy that I think Singapore avoids just through sort of the reality of the situation. The U.S. is such a cluttered media environment that it's not just the technology of social media, but it's so cluttered that the market rewards pugnacity, right? That it's no surprise people will forward or comment on the most outrageous comment made because it can be humorous or interesting or just shocking, right? But if somebody actually sits down and says, look, Donald Trump just put out 2,000-word essay on American foreign policy, not only nobody here I wouldn't read the damn thing. I mean, because who cares about 2,000 words about the foreign policy unless you're a farmer? But so the point is, our appetite, our attention order is just so much oriented towards social media now and away from the great daily papers.
And so you have to answer the most difficult question: what are the solutions? We know what the problems are. Are there any solutions to?
Well, first of all, can you hear me or not? Okay, good. First of all, I don't want you to get the impression from my presentation that I think Singapore is paradise on earth. Okay, much as I've said that there are good things happening, but I don't think it's paradise. I mean, it could be better, right? Or maybe some of you from ACS, you know, right? The best is yet to be, right? And it's always the best yet to be, right? No, I think what's happening in Singapore is that I think people feel that they have something to lose. Whereas maybe in UK and US, maybe those angry ones felt that they have nothing to lose by choosing somebody else or another option. But I think among Singaporeans, the majority feel that they have something to lose if they decided to kick out the PAP government, right? I don't know whether you buy what I've just said. So maybe another way to look at it is kiasula, right? Something to lose. You see, when you have nothing to lose, you don't care. But when you have something to lose, you really care. And I think on the side of the government is that I would say that there's enormous trust in the government, that maybe it's not always the best, but it's doing a pretty good job. All right, it can be better. So all we need is to make sure that they are on their toes, but not to demolish them altogether, right? And I think the government is PAP government is doing well because it observes good governance. It is responsive, I mean, largely responsive. It's transparent, and it delivers. So there are a lot of good things going. I know that it's politically correct to say, let's forget about, let's vote for something else. But the thing is that the future is at stake, you know. I know I'm beginning to speak like a PAP politician, right? But I'm not, as you know. But I think we can't risk it. Or at least we don't want to risk it because the water is really treacherous and we don't want to risk it.
Thank you. Let's take 3 more questions. Yes?
Hi, I'm Ruben, a freshman majoring in geography. So my question is this: what makes the current wave of populism unique? Like, population isn't a particularly new phenomenon. Like, Rome experienced it in the late Republic. America experienced it a few 100 years ago with Andrew Jackson. So what's special about this current wave, and what should we know of it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So your question is there anything distinctive about this wave of populism? Because we've experienced other waves before. Second question?
Yeah. My name is Anthony. I'm a year 2 student in Tembusu. So my question is open to everyone in the panel. So I understand that Brexit and the results of the US elections were more or less the products of populism in the Western world. But I want to divert our attention to a wave of populism that is very close to Singapore. I am an Indonesian. So currently in Indonesia, the Jakarta governor, if you follow the news, he is currently the only Chinese Indonesian and Catholic politician in a dominantly Muslim country. So last time he quoted a verse in the Quran during one of his rallies. One of the Islamic Defenders Front, they thought it was blasphemous and then appealed for him to be tried. So currently he is on trial and there's a very high possibility that he will be proven guilty. And my first question is, what do you all think will happen to Indonesia? Will it bow down to populism or will it survive? And my second question is, what advice can you give the Indonesian citizens to prevent something like Brexit or the results of the US elections from happening?
Thank you.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure whether what's going on in Jakarta in the governor's race is a case of populism. I think what is interesting about the race for the governor's election in Indonesia is that it's the first time that politicians have used race and religion to target an opponent. You know? And it's not a good development, because up to now, the Indonesians have not used race or religion to target an opponent. So what is very discouraging to many of us who are friends with Indonesia is to see this, and I hope it's not a precedent, because if it's a precedent, it's a very negative development, you know. But anyway, I'll ask the panel whether they want to answer your question.
Thank you.
Third question.
Hi, I'm Ryan, a year 1 biz and econ student. So in our discussions here, we've kind of talked about populism in a bit of a bad connotation. Like we use words like extreme left, extreme right. So can populism be good? That's my first question. And how do we convince those who actually believe in those populist policies? Because some of them, if you see what they say, they'll be like, you guys are elitists, you guys think you know what you're doing, etc. Is there a way we can actually convince them or like tell them why we feel that way?
Thank you. Good question. So is there such a thing as good populism? And how do you convince the people who have all these grievances? So we got some very good questions. What makes the current wave of populism unique or different? Is the campaign against the governor of Jakarta targeting his race and religion a case of populism? And can populism be good? Maybe we go the other way. I'll start with you, Answer.
Well, I think to begin with, I think that, the fact is people are suffering, right? I mean, we can't ignore that. We don't want to trivialize that, you know. People are suffering. But I think what's happening is that they think that there are no trade-offs, okay? All you have to do is ban immigration, forget about globalization, and everything will be back to, we get back to our good life again. And I don't think that's true, all right? So suffering is there, but the solution to that suffering is not to ban immigration or to forget about globalization. But I think what comes out of populism is that I think it does, in the Singapore case, right, put the governments on its toes. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, that's what democracy is about, right? That means the government, in a democracy, the government always have this fear, right, that you will lose the election. And I think that's what it's about. And I think in 2015, or 2011 at least, the government really feel that it's going to do badly. And I think that is important, because I think that is actually a trademark of democracy, that you can actually lose your election.
So would you say that is an example of good populism?
I would say so. I would say so, yes.
Okay. All right. Frank?
On the first question about populism unique this year, I'm not sure if I take the premise. I think the consequences in the United States are unique, that we've never had this kind of an anti-establishment candidate, that never in U.S. history has someone won the presidency who had never served in any government capacity. So certainly the consequences are unique. But I'd say the threat or the tendency of populism is persistent. And I don't know how you'd measure, is it more pronounced, is it less pronounced? So I remain unconvinced, right? But the consequences are particular to this race. Can it be good? Yeah, I tried to, in my remarks, say explicitly that these elements of populism can be positive or negative depending on how you weight them or how you mix them. And I would encourage someone running for office to at least, for example, make sure you have some kind of emotional connectivity. I mean, this is back to the Eleanor Roosevelt example, right? I mean, you know, miners have some complaints and you better go listen to them, right? And she obviously had the self-awareness or the kind heart or whatever you want to call it to say, I'm not going to cede that ground or come across like a snob by ignoring these people, right? So yeah, I think it would be a very healthy instinct. It's a question, I think, balance and mixing in a little symbolism with the right amount of substance. So you still have some passion, you can communicate in an upbeat fashion, but you've got an emotional connection with the audience.
Any comments on the governor's race in Jakarta, Frank?
Well, I'd just take your premise that I'd say identity politics takes the society the wrong way. And a polity is better off if we simply ask the question, who is the best person for the job? We might all have different answers. We might all come to different mental arithmetic. But what we shouldn't say is it has to do with the person's race or religion or whether it's male or female or any other, you know, personal element of that person's identity. We simply say, listen, we've got this opening. Who's the most qualified person for this opening? And so I'd have a merit orientation in society. And once you start stigmatizing groups or denigrating groups or saying this group is preferred, I think you cause enormous amount of fissures in society, right? So watch out.
Thank you, Frank. Jonathan?
Yeah, well, so one thing I noticed when you were all of you asking your questions is you're holding your mobile phone. And yesterday on Channel News Asia, they were talking about the launch of the relaunch of the Nokia 33 something, and you know, like moving backwards. So what we've got is a transformational moment in the way information is disseminated. Just as the sort of mass printing led to civil war in England, this sort of mass transformation of the way information is spread around causes a disruption. So I think that's what is making politics at the moment, go through a particular moment of change. I think that it's gone through moments of change in the past, and I'm sure it'll probably go through moments of change in the future. But it is a particular sort of crunch point of change. Terima kasih banyak for your question on Indonesian politics. I'm going to merge question 2 and question 3 together, because can populism be good? I'm a bit of a fan of Jokowi, and in fact I'm a huge fan of Jokowi, and I think he is a man who is a populist politician who is extremely effective. He is campaigning to his constituency of the vast majority of the Indonesian population who do not live in Jakarta, who are not from the sort of elite families, and he has a message for them that I will enable you to make your lives better than they currently are. I will enable you to help you reach your aspirations. That's what I did. I would like you to do the same. He's also he's got an amazing sense of humor, so that's particularly why I like him. But so I think that, yes, populism can be good. A politician can reach out to a very large section of the population for good, sensible, thoughtful reasons. So as for Ahok and the governor's race in Jakarta, it's a complex situation. It's a very emotional situation, and I think the trouble with bringing in identities into politics, and particularly playing on religious identity, is that it touches people in a different way, and sort of again merging questions 2 and 3. How do you persuade somebody who is who has a different opinion or who is seduced by a simple argument? In Northern Ireland, which throughout my lifetime in the 70s and 80s experienced a considerable amount of troubles and terrorists and conflict in the communities there, the way that those emotions were broken down were a way in which the peace process, which sort of forced the the people together in a private way, so that the different community leaders were brought together without the sort of glare of media, where they were able to talk and listen and sort of reach a point of understanding. And then they were forced to actually deal with things like pavements and schools and hospitals and water supply and transport. And there's nothing that sort of dissolves the emotional argument than the reality of there's supposed to be a bus every 20 minutes and it's actually only coming every 2 days. That's not good enough. The school is not working. There aren't enough doctors in my medical practice. If a politician is made to address those very practical, real issues, then the sort of emotional arguments, the empty arguments, don't bear any substance. So I think that what is needed to sort of diffuse that tension is a sort of focus on keeping it real.
All right. I think there's time for 3 more. Anybody else?
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Koh. My question's to everyone on the panel. From what I understand from during the Brexit American election, that there was a very low turnout for youth voters. And I think that caused huge losses for the swing states and then Brexit as well. And I think it's quite important to us, especially since university students, we're going to be the generation that's going to be inheriting these problems in this economy and this government. So I wonder what the panel has to say to us as a generation who quite often, I think the youth are very disenfranchised with sort of politics and the government's going on. So what would you say to them in our generation? Thank you.
Did you get the question?
I got the first part of that. There was low turnout.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry.
Speak slowly.
Sorry. My question is, given the low participation from the youth in Europe and America, and what would the panel have to say, given your experience with populism and voting, and as we are the generation going to be inheriting this economy and the problems that are facing it? So what would you say to us? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Harriman. I'm an exchange student from the UK. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the fact-checking and things like that going on in these elections. So one of the most devastating moments for me was when Michael Gove came on television and said something like, the British people have had it with experts. And for me, that was especially painful afterwards because it kind of symbolized a hopelessness that we can't get facts through to the people. And also with Donald Trump's campaign, a lot of the complaints have been about fake news. So my question is really, should there be some kind of fact-checking body like the Electoral Commission? And these bodies exist at the moment. Should they be given more powers? Do they have any kind of role in checking this kind of runaway alternative facts kind of arguments? So yeah, that's what I'd like to ask. Anyone can answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi. Hello to the panel. So actually my point is quite similar to Harman's one. So we have thought about populism and quite a negative connotation. So in a sense, actually, populism is kind of like the will of the people, the majority, correct, in a sense. So there are positive forms of this, say French Revolution, overthrowing the monarchy and building a republic. That kind of will of majority. So what I want to say is the rise of populism, kind of stems from the media and the appetite for sensationalist views, Mr. Frank has said, and I see that this sensationalist news is kind of skewed towards personal agenda or possibly manipulation of the masses behind the scenes. So similar to Harman's point, I want to say that inaccurate news and sources of information causes misinformed public and majority to form, which causes this negative populism to kind of have a rise, the rise of populism. So if there is a control over fake news, alternative news, and the such, would it also control the rise of negative populism as we have put it?
Thank you. One more question.
Good evening, panel. I'm a year 1 student from engineering science. So I'm going to give a quote from George Carlin, the late comedian. He said this, on voting day, I don't vote because I firmly believe that if you vote, you have no right to complain. I know some people like to twist that around and say, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. But where's the logic in that? Think it through. If you vote and you elect dishonest, incompetent politicians, and you screw things up, and then you're responsible for what they've done because you voted them in. So my question is, do populist voters automatically lose their rights to complain if their elected candidate do not deliver what they expected? And will this pride and ego sway their opinions in their future elections?
All right, thank you. I want to start with you, answer.
Can I try to answer a previous question also? Something about, is the current wave of populism, right? Is it any different, right, from the past? I think, in my view, every time there's a disruption, it will cause a reaction of some kind. And I think, so if you look at it that way, right, then there's nothing very new about populism as we see it now. Except that this time we have all this social media and, so things get travel a lot much faster than in the past. But certainly in the past, people do react to disruption as much as people are reacting to disruption nowadays. Okay, so that is the previous question. And, okay, this thing about fake news, right? I would say that, people want to listen to what they want to listen. So whether it's fake or not fake, I think if you are the kind who really gravitate towards things that are negative, right, you don't care whether it's fake or not, right? So I think people do choose. And even if you try and do a fact checking, right, I don't think it's going to have much impact on people like that, because you choose to listen what you want to listen to.
And is that a new phenomenon? Because of the internet, people tend to live in their own bubble, So you live in your own echo chamber. You tend to listen to like-minded people, and you believe in your facts, even if they are fake. Something new?
I think there must be some kind of psychological phenomenon. Right? In other words, you want to hear the things you want to hear, right? And because it supports your point of view, I'm sure there must be some psychological theory on that, right? Which I'm not familiar with. So all this thing about echo chamber and all that. I mean, so people end up talking to one another, listening to one another, and ignoring things that are contrary to what they believe in. I think that's what's happening.
Okay, Frank.
It's hard for me to think of a solution to fake news, a cure which is worse than the problem. And I'd be against any kind of government program, because I believe in freedom of speech, that you should be able to say whatever you want. And the premise of freedom of speech is you are capable of discernment, you are capable of evaluation, you are capable of drawing conclusions, you're capable of checking facts. So the premise is somewhat a compliment to the audience. I mean, that might be misplaced hope in the case of some of you, but I suspect for most of you, you actually think things through, and you're not given to jumping on something that appears sensationalist, right? So I believe in freedom of speech. I'll say this, I would encourage everybody here, I invite everybody here to spend 5 or 10 minutes when you go home, look at the RT cable channel. RT, Russia Today cable channel. RT, it's the Russian government news channel. But if you want to read about, and it's on the Singapore cable system, it's on StarHub. So if you want to watch about economic calamity in the West, meltdown, race riots, just the end of Europe and North America, spend a few minutes on RT, right? Now, if you want to write a letter to StarHub and say, my God, why don't we respect Ambassador Mueller here and get Danish TV on our channel here, which is going to be, I think, properly run. I would support that move, but I wouldn't support a government program to stop Russian propaganda in Singapore.
But Frank, wait, I wouldn't let you go at that. Isn't there a very serious problem right now in Washington? Because traditionally, Americans believe that you are entitled to your opinion, but not entitled to your facts. We must respect facts. And we must not consciously tell an untruth and call it an alternative fact. There's no such thing as an alternative fact. Shouldn't we be concerned about this development in Washington?
But what's hard for me to analyze, I would be concerned about it. What's hard for me to analyze is the extent to which it's just greater or more serious now than historically. So Barack Obama, when he first runs for president, does something that no U.S. presidential candidate in the modern era has ever done. he runs against trade. Trade is bad. Trade impoverishes America. We have to stop these trade agreements. They're harmful. When he comes in, he flips and he says, I was just sort of kidding. We're going to go ahead with these trade agreements, right?
No, he wasn't kidding. He grew in his job and he was educated.
This is a more elegant way of saying it.
Yeah.
This is a more elegant way of saying it.
Yeah,
he grew in his job.
Yeah, he grew in his job.
But I'm saying, was he using alternative facts? Was he lying? Was he being opportunistic? Was he being a bad populist? Now he's a good populist? Or did he just grow in his job?
No, I think...
Beats me. But he did exactly what Bernie Sanders did. Trade is bad. Exactly what Hillary Clinton did. Trade is bad. Exactly what Donald Trump did. Trade is bad. Who determines which one of these people are using alternative facts, which one of these people are being expedient, which one of these people are...
No, that's opinion. It's acceptable. It's acceptable for us to honestly disagree about whether trade is good or bad. That is acceptable. But it is not acceptable for someone to put forward a statement of fact knowing that it is false.
Yeah, all right, we could debate where you cross the line. But for someone to say that trade impoverishes the society, I would say that is an alternative fact. That is not reality.
No, that's an opinion, a wrong opinion. But
all right, but look, I take your premise. I take your premise that we should be concerned about carelessness in facts and people who invoke things that aren't true. It's hard for me to determine, is someone doing more of this, less of it, more casually, is it more accepted, less? That's I think harder to establish.
I think there should be an ethical norm that everyone should subscribe to, which is that we must respect facts. And we must not consciously put forward as a statement of facts a falsehood. You know, I think that's my point.
Yeah, good.
Okay, Jonathan.
Comment is free and facts are sacred. But the trouble is that that commentary can be used to to sort of portray facts in a way that might lead you to a different conclusion. So I would say that the way of challenging alternative facts is transparency and having as much every aspect of our society, open to transparency, able to be inspected, able to be examined, and that will challenge. That's the way to preserve the truth. As far as advice to a young generation, this makes me very depressed to be asked, that I am obviously not of a young generation anymore to be giving advice. So I'm Australian as well as being British. In Australia, like Singapore, I think voting is compulsory. So my advice to the young generation is to vote. To participate, to be involved, because unless you are, then you can't change things and you can't play a part in the change process. So I think those are the questions. Is that?
It's time to bring this to a close. So what I want to do is to ask each of the panelists to take 2 or 3 minutes to share with the student here your message. What is the principal message you want to share with them this evening? I start with your answer.
I think my message is that I don't want you to go away with the impression that everything is rosy, despite what I've said. I really believe that it's time that young people rise up and speak up and participate in civil society. It's no point just being academic about things, right? You should also be some kind of activist in society. So take charge of your future. I think it's time to rise up.
Frank?
I was reflecting on a question that had been asked somewhat earlier in the program, which is, so what's the solution? And we weren't able to fully give it justice in the panel discussion. But what I want to throw out, at the risk of coming across maybe as a bit rude, please take this as provocative, not rudeness. Maybe the problem's not government, maybe the problem's you. And if you go through life projecting your aspirations against the government, I think you're going to be unhappy. And what's important to you in your life, for a happy, successful life, might have very little to do with the government, right? I mean, do you have someone in your life who loves you and who you love? Do you have family that matters to you? Do you have a career where you're learning, you're growing? Do you have other projects where you can contribute and help others? Is there a spiritual side of your life? There are things that are important to you that really have nothing to do with the government. Now, there's a role for government programs, so I'm not speaking as an anarchist, but there are people who rely on government programs. But I suspect for most people in the room here, that's fortunately not the case. It's a very lucky group if you're Tembusu. So I'd say what you have to do, I think, is think, how far can I go in my life? How aspirational can I be? And that's getting this educational foundation you're getting here. It's having some capacity for experimentation, for broadening yourself, for getting outside of your habits and your tracks. It's for, I take Tommy's point, it's for connecting with people who have philosophies and views different than your own so you can try to learn and try to grow, right? But I think all of those elements are going to get you on track for a successful, happy life. And if you come up to me 5 years from now and I say, how are things going? And you say that government's not helping me, I will repeat myself. The problem is not the government, my friend, it is you.
It's rather daunting to be coming up with wise words. And I was trying to think of a wise quote to share instead. And so I think that I'll quote two wise people. One is the former US president who said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And I'll also then requote Professor Koh, and saying that we need to stick to certain values and principles that have served us well in the past. And I think what the Prime Minister in the UK is trying to do at the moment, is aiming to do with her speeches, is to counter that fear by explaining some of the forces that have led us to the situation where we are today, explaining the options, explaining the decisions that she will be taking, and doing that in a considered and transparent way. And so I think that is that she is both touching on both the trying to avoid and minimize fear, and also return to the values and principles that have served us well in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me conclude this forum by just sharing with you a few thoughts. I think we are living through a period of revolutionary changes. Changes brought about by globalization, by technology, by one of the biggest mass migration in human history. I think as a young person, you should look to your future with hope and optimism and not fear or pessimism. I think Singapore is well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that these revolutionary changes will bring to us. Free trade is on the whole a force for good. Certainly it generates winners and losers. And it is incumbent upon government to help those who have been dislocated by trade, to help them to transition to new jobs, to create new job opportunity, to reskill them, to upskill them. The same with technology. The history of technology is that for every job it destroys, it creates 2 new ones. The question is whether you are equipped to harness those opportunities. And I think you are fortunate in living in a country with one of the best education systems in the world. So you should be optimistic about your future. We cannot stop the world. We cannot roll back globalization. We cannot resist technology. And I'm glad that in Singapore we are not. We're trying to embrace technology, even if the technology is disruptive to incumbents. So whether it is Uber, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's fintech, I think we should embrace this technology and harness the opportunities. So I conclude by saying that, that if we don't look after our people well, if growth is not inclusive, if we don't educate our people well, then there's going to be a backlash. But if we do a good job, then we can put the fear of populism at bay. So my message to you, my concluding message to you is one of optimism and hope, that we live in an era of tremendous change, but there are many opportunities that these changes will bring to us. So grab them.